Title of the topic today is Strong Like Unto Moses, the Case for Ancient Roots in the Book of Moses based on Book of Mormon usage of related content. And I'd like to start off with a question. What if we had the brass plates? Imagine an archaeologist digging somewhere, maybe New York, Ohio, who knows where, Mesoamerica, finding a cave or a sarcophagus, whatever, that has these brass plates in. How did they get there? Who left them? Why? We don't know. But imagine this discovery. And we recognize these are actually the brass plates that were referred to in the Book of Mormon, filled with content from ancient writers, perhaps written in Egyptian, a combination of Egyptian and Hebrew. But imagine finding this relic. What would it change? What would it mean? We could imagine many critics and scholars suddenly saying, well, what about polygamy as their response? Or what about something else? This would certainly take a lot of the wind out of some critics' sails about the Book of Mormon. But in reality, in all seriousness, what would it do? It would change the way we approach many things. We'd learn all sorts of details about the ancient world. We would learn more about what the Book of Mormon means. We could see these original texts that were quoted, cited, or that otherwise influenced writers in the Book of Mormon. How would that change our understanding of Book of Mormon scripture? Think about what it would do for understanding the Bible. Now we would have an ancient version of Isaiah and the Torah and many other texts, far more ancient than anything we have. What would that tell us? How would we approach then theories such as documentary hypothesis and other things about the textual origins of the Bible with such original, valuable, raw data in our hands? It would be a miracle that would lead to all sorts of profound new treasures of knowledge. What if some of that miracle, though, is already with us? We have an interesting hypothesis to present today that some of the content from the Book of Moses and the Pearl of Great Price may actually be related to what might have been on the brass plates. In fact, the Book of Mormon and the Book of Moses, there's a very interesting story we'd like to point out to you. But let's first talk about this hypothesis. So what if the Book of Mormon were actually more closely related to the Book of Moses than we'd ever imagined? That would be very unusual, because especially when you consider the chronology. Book of Mormon was completed in 1829. The Book of Moses came later. It began after the Book of Mormon was completed. First, Moses chapter 1 was recorded in June of 1830. About a year after the Book of Mormon translation was finished. And then chapters 2 through 6 were later. Moses 7 comes in December of that year, Moses 8 in 1831. Many people assume that Joseph Smith's work with the Book of Moses and the whole Joseph Smith translation project, or inspired translation project, was a revision of the Bible, was Joseph's personal work, putting his ideas into the scriptures, taking the Bible and thinking, well, it would have been better if it had said this, being influenced from a variety of sources in his environment, maybe the Book of Mormon, Adam Clark, whatever, many environmental factors guiding him. It is often proposed as a theory. And I can see why people propose that. But Noel Reynolds had a very interesting twist that changed things a few years later. By the way, if you assume that Joseph Smith's work on the inspired translation that led to Moses, the Book of Moses, if you assume that that was his personal work, putting his ideas into print, then you would also conclude that any intertextuality, any common elements, phrases, concepts would be influenced by the Book of Mormon or influenced by his environment, as opposed to coming from inspiration. Noel Reynolds, though, had a fascinating observation that was published in 1990, and he has a paper called The Brass Plates Version of Genesis that is core to this work today. In this article, Noel finds links between the Book of Moses and the Book of Mormon that suggest a dependency on the Book of Moses in the Book of Mormon, that the Book of Moses might have been the origin for some of the phrasing, some of the concepts, some of the parallels that the Book of Mormon has, and not the other way around. That's very interesting, also potentially quite controversial. One example is there's a concept about the chains of darkness that's found in the Book of Moses that we also see hinted at in the Book of Mormon. And it was curiosity about this and another parallel that led me to connect with Noel Reynolds and look at his paper more seriously. Motivated by Noel Reynolds' original work, his pioneering work, we got together and started taking a closer look at some of the things that were taking place. If you want to see Noel Reynolds' paper, it's been published in the Interpreter, and I use tinyurl.com to make it really easy for you to go there quickly. So if you go to tinyurl.com/brassmoses, you'll go to Noel Reynolds' paper. And if you go to Brass Moses 2, you'll go to a paper that I wrote for the Interpreter that built on this with some preliminary thoughts of additional concepts. And now we've brought these together and added a lot more in the hypothesis we're going to propose to you today. Looking at Noel Reynolds' original paper, he has two groups of concepts that he talks about. The first group are concepts that he feels are clearly differentiated from anything in the King James Bible and that therefore can't simply be explained by Joseph Smith's knowledge of King James language. These include some very interesting concepts. Number one, the slide here lists some of the shortcuts that Noel had produced, but there's actually more to it than what you see in these shortcuts. So number one, for example, is transgression, fall, and fall death. But more specifically, we have the Book of Moses saying, by reason of, or because of the fall, because of transgression came the fall, and because of the fall came death. And we have very, very similar language in the Book of Mormon that is not found that way in the Bible. We have also other concepts relating the order of the priesthood and to days, years, and eternity in both texts, Book of Mormon and the Book of Moses. The Lord being God from all eternity to all eternity. Number four, God giving man his agency. This is a really core concept in the Book of Moses, the idea of free agency and Satan warring against trying to take away the free agency of man. And this seems to inform many writers, several writers in the Book of Mormon. And when you look at it, you can see that it has this feel of Book of Moses is the source, and people are alluding to or making reference to these concepts that are in the Book of Mormon. And we'll talk about that more later. There's a number of other concepts. I'll mention the last four on the slide. These all involve one verse in the Book of Moses, Moses 4:4, a fascinating verse that tells us a lot about Satan and how he operates. And we have things like devil being the father of all lies, or the devil leading men captive according to his will, or deceiving and blinding and then leading them, or the idea of his lies leading according to his will, deceiving them. These bits and pieces of Moses 4:4 are scattered throughout the Book of Mormon in a way that really suggests Book of Moses was the source and the derivative is the Book of Mormon. In fact, that verse, I'd like to just point out this, show you the verse, and the words that are found in the Book of Mormon are put in italics to show the connections. He became Satan, yea, even the devil, the father of all lies, to deceive and to blind men, and to lead them captive at his will, even as many as would not hearken unto my voice. Those words are used in many ways in the Book of Mormon, suggestive of a one-way dependency, where that is the core source that's being mined by different authors for different purposes, often in bits and pieces, but it fits very well as a potential source. So when we have this intertextuality, it's really fair to say, well, didn't Joseph just naturally take all those ideas in the Book of Mormon and stick them into the Book of Moses? Isn't that really the way it should be? Well, there are many examples. When you look at Noel's paper, when you read our paper, the details in several cases make it clear that that doesn't fit the data. For example, in 1 Nephi 16:38, we have this fascinating accusation that Laman is making. Laman is accusing Nephi of really being a bad guy. He says Nephi is somebody who lies. He deceives our eyes, and he thinks to lead us away for the purpose of making himself a king and a ruler over us, that he may do with us according to his will and pleasure. He is invoking many of the elements of Moses 4:4 that describe Satan. And when you understand the Book of Moses as the potential source for the Book of Mormon, or at least that something on the brass plates related to the Book of Moses might have been a source that Nephi is alluding to, this verse makes a lot more sense. It's not just Laman whining. It's Laman making a very serious accusation, probably the most serious accusation he could make, as if he is the pious one, and Nephi is the source of ultimate evil. He is a servant of Satan, and as a servant of Satan, he's a total apostate who needs to be killed, capital punishment. This is a life and death battle. Very ironic accusation that Nephi faithfully records. There's a lot of meaning that is added when we consider this possibility of a brass plates version of Genesis, like our Book of Moses, influencing the writers. Here's group 2 from Reynolds. These are concepts that also have some King James Version connections. In a few cases, I think Noel is being way too conservative in putting some of these concepts into group 2. For example, plan of salvation. The word plan does not occur in the Bible at all. But the concept of salvation and the scheme of salvation, it's there in the New Testament. So I think he was conservative on this. The other one, earth groans and rocks rending, there's a faint echo in the New Testament, but if you read the paper from Noel and see the details, the very strong details in the Book of Mormon versus the Book of Moses, I think that's also another very strong parallel. There's a large number. He has 33 total in his paper. We could talk about each of these at length. I'll point to a couple here on this slide. Number 21, the works of darkness. 22, secret combinations, a very strong Book of Mormon theme. We find Book of Mormon writers referring to this many times throughout the text, from Nephi all the way up to the end of the book, and yet the Book of Moses gives us some clear, strong details that appear to be alluded to or referred to or cited numerous times in the Book of Mormon, as if the Book of Moses is, in fact, the source. One of the issues that led me to team up with Noel was in responding to an anti-Mormon criticism, or a criticism of the Book of Mormon's use of Exodus themes. I was dealing with chapter 4, verse 2 in 1 Nephi. And Nephi had a comment that struck me as puzzling. This was not part of the argument from the critic, but this was a puzzle that I encountered just reading this verse. Nephi tells his brethren, "Therefore, let us go up. Let us be strong like unto Moses." Now, in this passage, Nephi is referring to Exodus themes in a variety of ways, so it makes sense he's referring to something on the brass plates. But what? Is there something in the Old Testament? I searched through the Torah, I searched through the Old Testament looking for references to Moses and strength, and found nothing. I found strong was being used in many ways to describe the hand of the Lord, to describe the things that the Pharaoh was doing, that the power of the waters and other things, but strong was not used to describe Moses. In fact, if anything, Moses is something of a weakling, because when it's time for this big battle, he has to hold up this staff, and it's too hard for him. He needs two people to stand by his side to help him hold up the staff for this scene in the Old Testament. He's not described as being strong. But in looking at the Book of Moses, I found a real interesting surprise. Moses 1:25, "Blessed art thou, Moses, for I, the Almighty, have chosen thee, and thou shalt be made stronger than many waters." In fact, there's a couple of references that hints at Moses and the theme of strength in Moses chapter 1. And this was a suggestion to me that, wow, has anyone looked? When I first read this, I thought, has anybody looked at the parallels between the Book of Moses and the Book of Mormon? Could there be a brass plates relationship going on here? And that's what led me to search and find Noel Reynolds' paper, and that really opened my eyes. And after reading Noel's paper, I looked at another opportunity. I said, maybe there's some more opportunities, more parallels that we should look at. And I was very intrigued by a very graphic image in Moses. The theme of Satan holding this great chain by which he veils the earth and holds people captive, these chains of darkness in the Book of Moses. And I wondered, does the Book of Mormon use that? Because I know the Book of Mormon talks about chains a lot. So I searched and was disappointed to find there's no combination of darkness and chains in any verse in the Book of Mormon. But as I kept looking, I found some parallels, possible parallels, beginning with 2 Nephi chapter 1. And let me talk about some of these links. While chains of darkness is not found, 2 Nephi 1:23, this is part of Lehi's farewell speech, links obscurity with chains. And obscurity means darkness, especially according to Webster's 1821 dictionary as part of the first definition. And there may even be a Hebrew wordplay there. I won't go into details there, but there's something interesting going on with this obscurity and darkness concept in Lehi's speech. And this led to some new parallels. And that was the beginning of looking at the possibility of many additional parallels beyond what Noel found, and this led to our collaboration. So here's a list of a few, numbers 34 through 41. I've already mentioned strength of Moses, chains of darkness. There are some others here. that are very interesting. We'll talk later about number 38, the use of satanic oaths and covenants and forming secret combinations, and quite a few, 38 through 41, you can see deal with secret combination themes. And there's more here. One of the ones is that one particular word I find interesting is misery in number 44, and also its combination with woe, misery and woe, which refer to the Satan and also his followers, the consequences of following him. Now, it's true the Bible tells you you're not going to be happy if you disobey don't keep the commandments, but a specific linking of the word misery with Satan or being a follower of Satan is something that we find in the Book of Moses and the Book of Mormon, but not really in the New Testament. Number 47 is also quite interesting, the theme of rage and Satan's dominion over the hearts of men. And we find that cited, referred to, hinted at, I think, quite a number of times in the Book of Moses. And again, in many of these cases, these references, if you think about it, are not clearly two-way, or really, there seems to be a one-way flavor that the Book of Moses may well have been the source what the Book of Mormon cites. For example, the strength of Moses. Nephi in 1 Nephi 4:2 is clearly alluding to something related to the Exodus, something related to Moses. He's not teaching why Moses was strong and how the Lord made him strong. He's just saying, let's be strong like Moses. It's an illusion. But in the book Moses 1, we have the very clear passage where the Lord is telling Moses why he's going to be strong. I am going to make you stronger than many waters. That's the source. The Book of Mormon is making an allusion. We find that also with the chains of darkness, this graphic visual theme in Moses, but then alluded to in many places, in many ways, often subtly in the Book of Mormon. One's more clearly the source, one's the derivative. Here's some more, 49 through 61. Now, I can get really boring here by listing all of these. They're in the paper. We go all the way through these. But I want to point out to you that some of these are, in my opinion, quite interesting. And they are not easily dismissed as something that is just naturally part of Joseph's vocabulary. I'll point out, for example, in terms of what's the source, theories about the source, if Joseph Smith were just plucking words in the Book of Mormon when he composed the Book of Moses, then a test for that theory is in the translation we have for the Book of Abraham. Why would he not be doing the same thing with the Book of Abraham? And the Book of Mormon mentions Abraham. Some of the themes in the Book of Abraham, creation and so forth, are in the Book of Mormon. So don't we have similar intertextuality? The answer is no. And that's a really subtle point, but an important one. If you look at the Book of Abraham and try to do the same exercise, looking for similar phrases and intertextuality, there is very, very little. And it's much different than the Book of Moses in terms of the denseness, the richness, and these very specific words and themes that are influencing the text. So it's a completely different case. 62 through 76. Number 62, for example, all things bearing witness of the Creator from the Book of Moses, found several times in the Book of Mormon. 65, spreading abominations and works of darkness, also in both texts. The idea of angels coming down as bearing testimony, a very specific concept found in both texts. Being prepared from the foundation of the world, very specific phrase used extensively in the Book of Mormon in many ways. Fearful looking for the fiery indignation of the wrath of God. A lot of concepts that deserve attention. We also have some compound parallels where one verse in the Book of Mormon seems to pull together 4, 5, 6 different themes or phrases from parts of the Book of Mormon to fulfill or to achieve a particular purpose. And I think the most interesting one of these to me might be the compound parallel number 86, which is one that appears to relate Enoch to Samuel the Lamanite. Enoch's call, the Lord's promise that he would protect him, preaching with a loud voice, preaching from a high place, angering the crowd, and there's a threat of killing him, but the Lord protects the prophet so he will not be pierced by those that are angry at him. There's multiple elements that make Samuel the Lamanite an interesting potential Enoch figure that's one of these compound parallels. And then there's some lesser ones that go up to number 97, but some of those are still interesting. Things like the idea of joy through the fall, dwelling in safety forever, being pierced by God's eye and God preserving his people. Some of these I call weaker because there's the possibility that this could just be a linguistic issue, a translation artifact, as opposed to a deep theme that is present in both. But let's look again at the chains of darkness. The Enoch text, the Moses text, Enoch beholds Satan. He has a great chain in his hand. It veils the whole earth. There's also spirits in prison, held captive in chains of darkness. There's a hint of this in Jude, and which also refers to the book of Enoch, but there's this idea, Satan, chains of darkness, veiling the earth, is very nicely brought out in the Book of Mormon in ways that point to a poetic relationship to the Book of Moses. And in fact, it's I'll show you this. It's the chiasmus, a big chiasmus in Lehi's farewell, that really invokes this theme nicely. From verses, actually should be starting with verse 13 through 23. We have Lehi telling his sons to awake from the sleep of hell, this dark period, darkness, sleep, and the chains. Shake off those chains. And then he concludes in the chiasmus with awake from these chains, come out of obscurity, and arise from the dust. So chains are being used here in poetry. In fact, many of the references to chains in the Book of Mormon are in a chiasmus. They're used poetically. And it's almost as if metal chains, while apparently not part of the New World for Book of Mormon peoples, long remained part of Book of Mormon poetry, possibly because of their presence in a very visual, poetical scene in something like the Book of Moses on the brass plates. Here's another example of an influential verse in the Book of Moses. This would be Moses 6:15. Here we read that the children of men, now every time there is a passage that's related to the Book of Mormon, it's in italics, and I'm also putting the number of the parallel in there. So these numbers are in the text. You can go and look each one up, number 74, for example. The children of men were numerous upon the face of the land, and in those days Satan had great dominion among men and raged in their hearts, and from thenceforth came wars and bloodshed, and a man's hand was against his brother in administering death because of secret works seeking for power. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 elements in Moses 6:15 that are all sort of standalone phrases and concepts that are used throughout the Book of Mormon in different ways, as if this were a rich source similar to Moses 4:4 being mined by the Book of Mormon. And another one is Moses 5:51 and 55. This involves talking about Cain and his secret combination and works of darkness beginning to prevail. And those are, again, spawn a lot of phrases and concepts throughout the Book of Mormon. There's 3 parallels listed there. Some of the details of secret combinations are another rich source of influence for the Book of Mormon. Number 38, the use of satanic oaths and covenants. Moses 5 and 6 repeatedly mention oaths and covenants with Satan, and Helaman 6 describes the secret oaths and covenants of the Gadianton robbers, part of Satan's works of darkness. As if, again, Book of Moses were the likely source for this. I mentioned misery and woe. Misery itself is a term that is used rather interestingly between the 2 texts, but the phrase misery and woe in particular from Moses 6:48 is found in the Book of Mormon in the same context of urging repentance and warning people about the consequences of following Satan. And the Book of Mormon uses this, I think, 4 times: an eternal gulf of misery and woe, state of endless misery and woe, gulf of misery and endless woe, everlasting misery and endless woe, getting more dramatic as we move through the text, these variations. And as Noel Reynolds points out, this may be a promising example of hendiadys, a common Old Testament figure of speech in which 2 nouns are linked with a conjunction like and they together they take on a combined meaning, often in a poetic or meaningful way. One of my favorites is number 50, esteeming God's words as naught. Here we have Moses 1:41. In a day when the children of men shall esteem my words as naught, and take many of them from the book which thou shalt write, behold, I'll rise up another like unto thee, and they'll be had again. The word not occurs only twice in the King James Bible. Whether you spell it N-O-U-G-H-T or N-A-U-G-H-T, it's very rarely used. But here we have a very specific use, esteeming words as not, referring to Scripture. We have the same context, the same phrase in 2 Nephi 33. They cast away many things which are written and esteem them as things of naught. And 1 Nephi 19, we also have them not only esteeming words as naught, but trampling the Savior as if he were a thing of naught. Esteeming these, they take things that should be esteemed of great worth and they're set at naught. These, again, appears to be an allusion to what we have in the Book of Moses. And there's many more. I found this to be a fascinating exercise. I'm so grateful for this chance to collaborate with Noel Reynolds. We have nearly 100 apparent parallels between the 2 that are not easily explained away as just being derived from the King James Bible or as being from Joseph's own dialect. Many dozens of Book of Mormon verses appear to draw upon Book of Moses language and concepts, especially from the writers who are most familiar with the brass plates. Nephi leads the pack. He was the one closest to the brass plates, and he uses brass plates lingo, brass plates phrases and concepts more than anyone else. But Alma uses a lot too, Jacob also, and we find them throughout the Book of Mormon. But there's preponderance by those early writers, King Benjamin as well. Evidence exists that the derivation is one way. In many cases, you can make a very clear case that it would be more logical for the Book of Moses to be the source, Book of Mormon to be the derivative. The density, distribution, and depth of these parallels are hard to explain based on chance alone or upon Joseph just drawing upon his environment and dialect, especially when you consider you don't have this in the Book of Abraham. These connections call for reconsideration of the nature of the Book of Moses and its relationship to possibly real ancient brass plates. One of the themes that's especially brought out in this analysis is the way Satan works. The Old Testament says very little about Satan, and some scholars think Satan and the devil are kind of a late development after the time of Nephi. But the numerous common elements regarding Satan and his goals, his secret works, his oaths and combinations, etc., point to dependency on the Book of Moses, or the brass plates, I should say, including, for example, Laman's accusation of Nephi. Recognizing the ancient roots of these LDS texts could really help us revolutionize scholarly understanding of the Bible, of ancient Hebrew thought, for example, as well as better understanding the Book of Mormon. I want to make a point about Nephi, the author of 1st Nephi and 2nd Nephi. He was obviously very familiar with the brass plates, and he was strongly influenced, it appears, by the Book of Moses. But just as the writings of Moses may have strongly influenced Nephi, Nephi's writings strongly influenced other writers who would quote him, allude to him, all the way up to Moroni, who quotes Nephi heavily in his final words. These dependencies and allusions are extensive and intricate. But the translation of 1st and 2nd Nephi came after the rest of the text that draws upon it, just as the translation of the Book of Moses came after the Book of Mormon translation was completed. This is difficult to do if Joseph were just making things up. It becomes nearly impossible if the witnesses of the translation process are correct and that he was spewing out large quantities of text while looking into a hat. Doing this, creating these kind of intertextual dependencies with this one-way flavor is something far beyond most modern writers. So some conclusions we offer. The relationship in language and themes between the Book of Moses and the Book of Mormon is extensive, not easily explained by just Joseph's familiarity with the King James Bible. There's evidence in many cases of a one-way dependency in this relationship, as if the Book of Moses or something like it on the brass plates were the source being alluded to. In some cases, this may support tight translation also in terms of how Joseph did both the Book of Mormon and perhaps the Book of Moses. It's speculative. The connections are more than just shared phrases. In some cases, there is common context and common implications or common additional elements that really strengthen this as part of a very deep whole, and not just a random chance thing. For example, the extensive ways that some Book of Mormon writers draw upon the Book of Moses supports the case for the reality of the brass plates and the antiquity of both the Book of Mormon and the Book of Moses. So our hypothesis today, we propose for your consideration, is that this puzzling text, the Pearl of Great Price, or rather the Book of Moses in the Pearl of Great Price, is a link between the ancient brass plates and the gold plates. Wouldn't that be an amazing miracle if it's true that we have bits and pieces of the brass plates before us already through the miraculous translation of the very ancient Book of Moses? We offer that proposal for your consideration. Hope you'll read the papers and give it some thought. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you guys for being with us. That was a wonderful presentation. You're a very dynamic presenter, by the way. And I thoroughly enjoyed that. We've got a few questions for you guys. First off, so you mentioned, one of my questions was, can we do the similar thing with the Book of Abraham? And you categorically stated, not really. Could you maybe clarify briefly why you think the Book of Abraham would be ill-fitting for this sort of paradigm that you're describing?
Noel's the one who dug into this first. You care to comment?
I'll let you go.
Okay.
Carry it forward. You're doing a great job.
Well, yeah, this is a fun exercise. Intertextuality is really fun, and you can have all sorts of fun. You can pick ancient text I just did a little blog post on my Mormonity blog about a very interesting proposal that the Book of Ether is derived from this book about the Hindus, the chronology of the Hindus written by Alexander Hamilton from 1821. And it's really interesting when you first read this proposal. Wow, they've got a couple dozen potential parallels. When you dig into it, you realize, oh, they're stretching, there's not even close. The best you've got is a guy named Jacob has a brother. Oh, it's brother of Jacob, brother of Jared, rather. You can find bits and pieces. You can find parallels all the time, and some people get real excited about it. In this case, by the way, I'll just mention that 1821 text appears to have only been in a few places in England and didn't make the US until decades after the Book of Mormon came out. A very rare book. In this case, we have the Book of Abraham and the Book of Mormon, and they have similar concepts in some cases. God, creation, there's a reference to stars a couple of times. So you can sit there and look through those passages and just try to do the exercise that I went through for the Book of Moses. Just try to find things that are being quoted in the Book of Mormon. There's a couple of words here and there. God is created, and mentioned, and creation, but things that are unique, not in the King James Bible, that really stand out as if the Book of Mormon were drawing upon the Book of Abraham. I can't find it. I mean, maybe I'm not looking in the right places. I know Noel has taken a look at this. It just doesn't pop out. Whereas in the short Book of Moses, we've got roughly 100 interesting parallels, many more if you start counting things that are also clearly present in the King James Bible, because they both are using that very heavily. But the ones that are interesting, that point to ancient roots, getting 100 in such a short amount of text, people digging through hundreds of pages of various books that are proposed as books that Joseph plagiarized from, they're happy to find 5, 10, 20, and that's out of hundreds of pages of text to work with. Here we have this short little text, and it's rich with 100 parallels. That's quite unusual. And they're parallels that inform you, that show there's added meaning that you get by considering the parallel. When you look at the Hindus, the book on the Hindus, and link it to the Book of Mormon, you find this parallel about, one of the parallels was both people, both involve neglect of God, and God being angry about the neglect of worshiping God, or of praying, or of worshiping God. And you go and look at the parallel in the actual book, there's a phrase about someone was negligent in worshiping the divine cow, and the divine cow was angry about this. And that's not a very strong parallel. It doesn't give you any insight into the Book of Mormon. It's just one of those random chance things. But the Book of Moses parallels often give you insight that informs you. Oh, here's what they were alluding to. Allusions to Scripture are often done by just quoting a little bit, just making a reference to a story, and the reader's supposed to understand it and fill in the blanks. When Nephi tells his brothers, be strong like Moses, there's a backstory that they both understand. We didn't know that backstory from the Old Testament. Now we get it when we read Moses 1. It explains. So it's not just word strong, bingo. There's a story that flows one way and informs you. You don't find that in the Book of Abraham. Now, if I'm wrong, I challenge readers, please let me know, because I just probably haven't been diligent enough. There might be some, but I can't see it.
On that same point, I would point out that when I did this study back in the late 1980s, the first study, I had no idea that there would be 100 of these kind of things. So what did I come up with, 35 or something like 33, that? 33. And I was using the computer a lot to come up with those. Of course, that was a different day with computers too. But I've just really been appreciative of what's been done here by Jeff in extending that, getting that larger vision, and seeing all kinds of additional connections. And I challenge anybody to find a way of explaining away that many occurrences in that small amount of text. It's just, it's the kind of thing, if you found that in Bible studies or in any other study of any other kind of literature in the world, you would have absolutely no objection to drawing hard conclusions about the connection between the texts.
I think what you guys point out touches on an important idea that sometimes scholars will argue that, well, you have all of these parallels with 19th century literature, as you mentioned, or there's all these parallels with the Bible, therefore Joseph Smith could have gotten them from there. But then on the other opposing side, you have people like yourselves arguing that you've got all these ancient parallels that can't necessarily be explained that way. And to an unassuming viewer like myself, it might seem like a glass half empty, glass half full sort of paradigm. I mean, who do I believe? The people who say this is 19th century comparisons that are valid, or the ancient ones? And I don't know, do you have any advice for viewers to be sifting through this to find what's the most persuasive and compelling evidence for if it's an ancient or a modern text?
One thing I like to ask people to think about when they're looking at modern sources, and they often use the word plagiarism. You know, oh, this one has this text has the word cattle. Book of Mormon has cattle. Could that be a source? And that's actually, I'm not kidding. That's they'll find curious workmanship is one of the one that comes up frequently. Oh my goodness, here's a book from 1812 that has the word curious workmanship, and there it is in the Book of Mormon. That seems compelling until you realize that our word, the way we say something of really fine workmanship might be fine workmanship today. If you do a Google Ngram of curious workmanship versus fine workmanship, you see that curious workmanship is not used at all today, but it was far more common in Joseph Smith's day. It was a normal vocabulary phrase. Hundreds of books have that out there. Thousands of books have curious workmanship. It was what you said instead of fine workmanship. So there's not something really super unique about the word curious. So the issue is, does it inform you? Does it explain? If it informs you, it should explain how Joseph did his crafting of the Book of Mormon. The things that people say Joseph plagiarized from almost never show that he could how he would create the Book of Mormon. It was a word here, a word here, a word here, a word here, and it looks like, oh my goodness, for Joseph to create this one verse, he had to use 10 different books, search through 500 pages here, 300 pages there, 200 pages there. He had to do about a month's worth of work to come up with one verse. And that's ridiculous. Plagiarism should make your life easier, not harder. And what people propose is usually a model that has no information about how it would have helped Joseph Smith or how it informs the text, anything at all. When you're talking about ancient origins and ancient allusions, there the goal isn't making your life easier, it's adding meaning. And the question is, do these ancient sources give you added meaning? Does it enrich the text? Is it something that an ancient person would do? If Nephi is saying, you know, be strong like unto Moses, and he's referring to something, then you find a potential source. Does it suddenly make sense? Does it add richness? If you read Laman's accusation, now read the Book of Moses, does it suddenly make sense? Oh, wait, Laman's saying Nephi needs to be killed because he's like Satan. The ancient roots that we're proposing, as a rule, give you ooh and ah moments of awe. That makes sense. Now there's added meaning, as opposed to, oh, they both use and it came to pass. Bingo, I found the smoking gun. There's very shallow, superficial relationships in what's being proposed as modern sources, deep, meaningful relationships when we look at the ancient text.
One side note that may fit in here and be worth calling attention to is the fact we are dealing with English translations on all of this. And where do those English translations come from? Jeff's alluded to some of the problems with people looking at the 19th century as the source for the English of the Book of Mormon and the Book of Moses. But for the Book of Mormon, we now know through studies of over the last couple of years, particularly Stan Carmack and Royal Skousen, that the English in the Book of Mormon is typical of a generation earlier than the King James Bible.
In many cases.
In many cases. And some of that language has carried over to where it still has meaning in Joseph Smith's time, and a lot of it hasn't. And a lot of it we stumble on. Joseph Smith stumbled on a lot of it, even changed some of it in the revisions of the Book of Mormon because it was so awkward. But when we go back to the 150 years before the King James Version, all of this language can be attested as being standard English. So now we don't know what to do with that. We can't explain that, but one thing it does is it takes away the long-standing arguments. One, that the Book of Mormon, the awkwardnesses in the grammar and the language, the vocabulary of the Book of Mormon come from Joseph Smith's frontier English there's just no support for that in language studies. And then, but the second one, that he got it from his familiarity with the King James Bible, has also been put into question. And so, but we do have to remember that we are dealing with English translations here, and that that always introduces a bit of uncertainty in any kind of conclusions that we can draw.
And then one last question before we head into our break is, I personally love the point you guys were making about Satan and how we have so much more information in the Book of Mormon than we do in biblical texts about Satan, and how it seems likely that that is derivative or influenced by the Book of Moses. And it seems to make a lot of sense, since in 2 Nephi 2, Lehi gives a discourse about Satan, and it says that he supposed the existence of Satan, almost as if he is, trying to put together the pieces now as opposed to previous knowledge. And so would you guys suggest that much of the influence the Book of Moses has on the Book of Mormon is, I don't know how to describe this, like newly inputted into their consciousness, as opposed to previous biblical Israelite understandings of things, but rather the Nephites have these plates of brass for the first time, and that completely changes their perception, and that's what influences the Book of Mormon from here on out? I don't know if that makes sense.
I think it's a very subtle point, a very, very good question. I like the way you put that, and I think it's fair. I know the verse you're talking about, and it does have the feel that Lehi is learning things. And that the suppose doesn't sound like I just got this big revelation. It sounds like I'm learning it from a text. So that's a really good point that maybe we should highlight and explore in more detail.